I stared at my phone screen in the parking lot of Target, reading her text for the fourth time while my groceries sat melting in the back seat. "I'm not coming back. I've met someone much better and younger than you ever were." The words blurred as my hands started shaking, and I could hear the couple arguing 2 cars over, their voices sharp in the humid evening air. 15 years of marriage, 2 kids, a mortgage we'd just refinished together last month, and she ends it all with a text message sent from some beach resort in Cancun where I'd paid for her girls' trip. I set the phone down on my lap and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not heartbreak, not yet, but something harder and more patient. The woman I'd trusted with everything had just thrown our entire life away for what sounded like a vacation fling, and she was so confident I'd just roll over and take it that she couldn't even be bothered to call. My name is Garrison, and before that text destroyed everything, I had what most people would call a good life. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm downtown, the kind of place where coffee rings stained every blueprint and the air always smelled like sawdust and ambition. My corner desk overlooked the loading dock where trucks came and went all day, their diesel engines rumbling like a heartbeat I'd grown used to over 12 years. I was good at my job, really good. I could look at a foundation pour and tell you if the crew was cutting corners, could spot a problem 3 weeks before it would cost us money. At home, our 2-story colonial on Maple Street felt like the American dream we'd built brick by brick. Natasha would be in the kitchen most evenings when I came through the garage door, usually stirring something that smelled like garlic and herbs, her dark hair pulled back in that messy bun she'd worn since college. The kids would be scattered between homework and video games, and for a long time, that chaos felt like everything I'd ever wanted. I'd coach Little League on Saturdays, help with math homework at the kitchen table, and every few months we'd load up the SUV for camping trips to the state park where we'd met during a company picnic 15 years ago. I still remembered how to tie a bowline knot from my Navy days, still kept my tools organized in the garage the way my father taught me. Small things, maybe, but they felt like pieces of who I was, someone reliable, someone who showed up. If this story hits home, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these for a reason. Looking back, I can see now how it started falling apart, but at the time it felt like normal marriage stuff, the kind of drift that happens when you're both working and raising kids and trying to keep a house from falling down around you. Natasha started staying out later after work, claiming drinks with coworkers or book club meetings that seemed to happen 3 times a week. She'd come home smelling like wine and perfume I didn't recognize, her eyes bright in a way that made me feel like I was interrupting something. The first real crack came during Tommy's birthday party last spring. I'd spent the morning setting up our backyard, stringing lights between the oak trees and arranging folding chairs in a circle around the fire pit. When Natasha finally emerged from the house, she looked stunning in a dress I'd never seen before, something flowing and expensive that made her look 10 years younger. But instead of helping with the party prep, she spent the entire afternoon on her phone, texting someone and laughing at messages I couldn't see. When I asked her to help me light the birthday candles, she looked at me like I'd interrupted her during brain surgery. She rolled her eyes and told me she was dealing with something important from work, but her phone screen wasn't showing any work emails, just a text conversation with someone named Alex whose profile picture was too small for me to make out clearly. The second moment that should have been a warning came 3 weeks later when I found her trying on clothes in our bedroom, outfits spread across the comforter like she was preparing for something special. When I asked what the occasion was, she told me it was nothing, just updating her wardrobe. But these weren't clothes for grocery runs or parent-teacher conferences. These were clothes for someone who wanted to be noticed, wanted to feel desired. When I complimented her on a particularly stunning black dress, she barely looked at me and said maybe I should pay attention to things like that more often. That night, I lay awake listening to her breathe beside me and realized I couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at me the way she used to, like I was someone worth looking at. The morning before she left for Cancun, I found her in our bathroom applying makeup with the kind of precision I hadn't seen since our wedding day. The counter was covered with products I didn't recognize, expensive bottles and compacts that definitely hadn't been there a month ago. When I asked if she was excited about her girls' trip, She glanced at me in the mirror with an expression that made my stomach drop. She told me she deserved this vacation, that she'd been feeling trapped lately and needed some time to figure things out. The way she said "figure things out" felt like a door slamming shut. I asked her what that meant, and she turned around to face me directly for the first time in weeks. She told me I wouldn't understand because I was content to just drift through life without ever asking for anything better. Standing there in my work clothes, watching her transform herself into someone I barely recognized, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about a vacation anymore. This was about her preparing to leave me, and she was being so obvious about it that she might as well have announced it at breakfast. The morning she flew out, I drove her to the airport in silence. She kissed my cheek at the departure curb like we were distant relatives, grabbed her suitcase, a new one I'd never seen before, and walked through those automatic doors without looking back. I sat in my truck in the parking garage for 20 minutes, watching planes take off and knowing in my gut that our marriage was on one of them. 3 days later, that text arrived while I was buying groceries for dinner she'd never eat. 15 years of marriage, 2 kids who adored their mother, a house full of memories we'd built together, and she threw it all away for someone she'd known for less than a week. The cruelty of it wasn't just the betrayal, it was how casually she expected me to accept it, like I was some obstacle she'd finally worked up the courage to step around. That first night after the text, I sat in my truck in our driveway for 2 hours, unable to face going inside and explaining to Tommy and Sarah why Mom wasn't coming home. The house looked different somehow, smaller, quieter, like a stage set after the actors had gone home. When I finally walked through the front door, everything looked exactly the same, but felt completely foreign. Her coffee mug still sat in the sink from 3 days ago, and her reading glasses were folded on the kitchen counter next to a stack of mail she'd never opened. I called in sick the next day and spent the morning walking through our house like a crime scene investigator, looking for clues I'd missed. In her dresser drawer, I found receipts for clothes I'd never seen her wear, restaurant charges from places we'd never been together, and a credit card statement showing purchases that painted a picture of someone planning an exit strategy. The woman I'd shared a bed with for 15 years had been living a completely different life, and I'd been too trusting or too stupid to see it. By the 3rd day, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just someone who drifted through life without asking for anything better. Maybe I was boring, predictable, the kind of man a woman eventually outgrows like an old coat she's tired of wearing. But then I was cleaning out the garage and found a box of photos from our early years, pictures of us camping, fixing up our first apartment, me teaching her how to change a tire in the rain. In one photo, she was looking at me while I wasn't paying attention to the camera, and her expression was pure adoration. That woman had loved me completely, and I had loved her the same way. Whatever happened to our marriage, it hadn't happened because I was fundamentally unlovable. It happened because she chose someone else, and she chose to handle it in the cruelest way possible. That night, something cold and determined settled in my chest. Not revenge exactly, but clarity. I wasn't going to roll over and let her walk away from our life without consequences. The first thing I did was call a lawyer, not the family friend we'd used for our wills, but someone who specialized in divorce cases where one spouse had been particularly ruthless. Margaret Chen's office smelled like leather and fresh coffee, and when I showed her the text message, she actually winced. She told me that in cases like this, where abandonment was this clear and cruel, we could make things very difficult for Natasha, especially regarding custody and asset division. But I wanted more than just a good divorce settlement. I wanted her to understand what she'd thrown away, and I wanted everyone in our circle to see exactly who she really was beneath the act she'd been putting on for months. My first move was simple but effective. I changed all our passwords, bank accounts, streaming services, credit cards, everything. When she tried to use our joint account to extend her stay in Cancun, the card was declined. She called me screaming, demanding I restore her access immediately. I told her that married couples shared financial responsibilities, but since she'd made it clear our marriage was over, she'd need to fund her new life herself. The second phase was trickier. I knew she'd been telling people that our marriage had been rocky for years, painting herself as the victim of a stale relationship. So I started sharing the truth, not maliciously, but factually. When her sister called to ask what was happening, I showed her the text message and the credit card statements. When our neighbors asked where Natasha was, I told them she decided not to come home from her girls' trip. When her book club friends reached out, I forwarded them screenshots of her message and asked if they could help me understand what I'd done wrong. The responses were swift and brutal. Her sister was horrified. Our neighbors were shocked. Her book club friends were outraged on my behalf. Within a week, the narrative she'd been carefully crafting about our failing marriage crumbled completely. Everyone could see that she hadn't been trapped in a loveless relationship. She'd been planning an escape while letting me pay for her new wardrobe and vacation. But I wasn't done yet. 2 weeks after her text, Natasha finally called instead of messaging. Her voice was different, smaller, less confident. She told me she'd made a mistake, that the man she'd met wasn't who she thought he was, and that she wanted to come home and work things out. The desperation in her voice told me everything I needed to know about her vacation romance. It had been exactly what I'd suspected, a fantasy that couldn't survive contact with reality. I let her talk for 10 minutes, listening as she tried to rewrite history, claiming she'd been confused and overwhelmed, but had never meant to hurt me. When she finally stopped talking, I told her I'd received her message loud and clear. She'd said I was someone she could replace with anyone better and younger, and I believed her. So I'd started the paperwork to make that replacement permanent. The silence on the phone stretched for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she started crying, not the gentle tears of someone who is sorry, but the harsh sobs of someone who'd just realized the consequences of their choices. She begged me not to file for divorce, promised she'd do anything to fix things, swore the whole trip had been a terrible mistake she'd regret forever. I told her she was absolutely right, it had been a terrible mistake. But it wasn't the kind of mistake you make accidentally. You don't accidentally book a separate room from your girlfriends. You don't accidentally meet someone and decide your husband is disposable. You don't accidentally send a text message designed to inflict maximum pain. Those were choices, and choices have consequences. When she asked what she could do to fix things, I told her it was too late. The divorce papers would be filed Monday morning, and given her abandonment of our family and her own written confession that she'd found someone better, the settlement would heavily favor me and the kids. She'd thrown away 15 years of marriage for a vacation fling, and now she'd have to live with that choice. The last thing I heard before hanging up was her promising that Alex, the man she'd met, had meant nothing, that he'd just been using her for a good time and had disappeared the moment things got complicated. I told her I was sorry she'd learned that lesson the hard way, but I was no longer available to help her process the consequences of her choices. 6 months later, I was sitting in my backyard on a Saturday morning, watching Tommy practice pitching against the garage door while Sarah read in the hammock I'd hung between the oak trees. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, and for the first time in months, the house felt peaceful instead of empty. Natasha had moved in with her sister across town and saw the kids every other weekend. The settlement had been exactly what Margaret Chin had predicted. I kept the house, the majority of our savings, and primary custody. More importantly, everyone in our circle knew exactly what had happened and why. There had been no opportunity for her to rewrite history or play the victim. The construction company had promoted me to senior project manager after I'd thrown myself into work during the worst of the divorce proceedings. My new office had windows that faced the mountains instead of the loading dock, and I'd started dating again, nothing serious yet, but it felt good to have conversations with women who saw me as someone worth getting to know. The strangest part was how little I thought about her anymore. For months, she'd occupied every corner of my mind, but now she felt like a chapter in someone else's story. The man who'd trusted her completely and been blindsided by her cruelty was still part of me, but he wasn't the whole story anymore. Tommy struck the garage door with a perfect fastball, and the sound echoed across our backyard like applause. Sarah looked up from her book and grinned at her brother, and for a moment I felt the kind of contentment I hadn't experienced in years, not the desperate happiness of someone trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, but the solid satisfaction of someone who'd weathered a storm and found himself still standing. Last week, I ran into one of Natasha's friends at the grocery store, the same Target where I'd first read her text message a year ago. She told me Natasha was struggling, that the reality of being a divorced single mother working retail wasn't matching the freedom she'd imagined. She asked if I ever thought about giving her another chance, for the kids' sake. I thought about it for exactly as long as it took me to remember sitting in my truck that night, reading those words designed to make me feel small and replaceable. Some betrayals are too calculated, too cruel to ever really forgive. Not because you can't find it in your heart to forgive them, but because forgiving them would require forgetting who you are. The truth is, she did me a favor with that text message. She showed me exactly who she was when she thought I had no choice but to accept it. She revealed that the woman I'd loved for 15 years had been capable of cruelty I never could have imagined. And in trying to make me feel worthless, she'd actually freed me to discover that I was worth much more than she'd ever appreciated. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who force us to stop settling for less than we deserve. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the push you needed towards something better. And sometimes the person who tells you they've found someone better is really just telling you that you deserve someone better too.